Hello and welcome again to yet another episode of This Week in Christian History. And we are glad to have a repeat performance from Dr. Michael Haykin, who is at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Dr. Haykin was kind enough to be our podcast guest on our third episode. And so here we are on episode 63. So it's been quite a run, and we are grateful for you have done that for us then. And we're grateful again to see you again today. So thanks, Dr.
Yeah,
Hagan, for coming.
it's a pleasure. Yeah, my
Uh,
joy.
well, we're going to talk about Constantine, and we're using his death date as a way to kind of, as a portal to be able to talk about him. But, you know, it just seems like when you put on the top 10 list or you put on the top high end of the list of things that happen, whether they were kind of tipping points or events or things that Constantine's conversion certainly seems to be way up at the top of that list. Is that probably correct?
Yeah, it definitely is for the history of Western Christianity. Other different uh, contexts, it would not be maybe as important. So, for instance, thinking about Armenian Christianity, Ethiopic Christianity,
Mm.
where the embrace of Christianity by the ruling powers came around the same time, or even maybe a wee bit earlier. But Constantine is a pivotal figure for us as Western Christians. And there's no doubt in my mind that it figures among the top, 10, 12, baker's dozen, whatever.
Right, right. Worth the study and worth
Oh,
worth
yes.
the. Well, give us some background on Constantine. How did he? Let's talk maybe a bit about his rise to power. If I remember right, his father was a leading figure, right? One of these Caesars or Augustuses or whichever ones they were, right? Whenever Diocletian was dividing the empire up from the Roman Empire, of course, we're talking about.
Yeah, so yeah, the background to Constantine is the chaos of the third century. One of the long-standing questions in Western history, Western historians have debated, the causes for the fall of the Roman Empire in the late fifth century or the early fifth century, depending on when you date it. But the third century is a critical century as well, because to all intents and purposes, the empire should have fallen. Between roughly 220 and 284, you had somewhere in the vicinity of probably around 40 emperors in the space of about 60 years.
Mm.
Um, some of them usurpers seizing part of the empire, etc. All of whom, except for two, died violently, either by assassination or killed on the battlefield. You have massive economic inflation. You have invasions by both the Germanic tribes on the Rhine and Danube frontiers, and then in the Eastern Roman Empire, the ongoing conflict with the Persian Empire and significant losses there. One of the emperors, Valerian, ending up being captured by the Persians and imprisoned. And when he died in prison in the Persian Empire, excuse me, he was basically stuffed by a taxidermist and stuck in a corner of the Persian king's palace. Um, so these sorts of losses were, or these setbacks were significant. And in 284, a lifer in the Roman army who had worked his way up through the ranks, Diocletian, was appointed or seized power in a coup. And if you'd been living at the time, you'd have thought he'd just be one of another,
Mm.
long list of short-lived emperors. But he reigns until 305, and he begins a reconstruction of the empire on along a variety of lines, one of which was his recognition that the empire had become utterly too unwieldy for
Mhm.
one administrative center to govern. And so he divides the empire logically into the two parts of the Greek-speaking East and the Latin-speaking West. Latin would have been spoken in the East, and Greek to some degree in the West, but those fault lines were probably a good way of administratively dividing the empire. And because the issue at the heart of the issue in the third century was the peaceful transfer of power, he set up an arrangement where there was a emperor in both the East and the West, and a vice emperor, if you want to describe it that way, in both
Hmm.
East and West. The emperor was known as the Augustus. Augustus was always a title, and then the vice emperor was a Caesar. So he was the Augustus in the East. Um, Maximian, one of his loyal lieutenants, was the Augustus in the West. And then his Caesar in the East, the man who would eventually replace him. So he had this arrangement that the emperors would at some point step down. This had never been done.
Hmm.
Was a man named Galerius, who had a vicious hatred of Christianity. And then the Caesar in the West was the father of Constantine, Constantius Chlorus. And Chlorus was a nickname meant pale face. So it
Huh.
obviously, most Romans would have been olive skinned because of their Southern European origin. And he obviously did not have the same amount of melanin, I guess, in his skin. And so he was known as pale faced. And so Constantius Chlorus was the Caesar in the East, in the West. And so Constantine was raised in a family that was very used to power
Mm.
and ambitious. There's no doubt in my mind that if you read the primary sources that relate to Constantine, either texts that have survived in stone inscriptions, or texts that have survived in terms of contemporaries writing about his reign, he was a man who was used to power, desirous of power, etc. And so in the year 305, Diocletian, and by this point he had initiated, probably on the urging of Galerius, a vicious persecution against Christianity. The Diocletianic persecution is the last great persecution of the Roman Church, of the Roman state. And
And just to just make for clarity spot, this is part of what we did with our other episode. That's also known as the edict against the Christians sometimes as well, right?
yes,
As a way to be able, they're synonymous with this
yep,
Diocletian edict, but it's just to framework that, right? I mean, just
correct.
to connect that dot. Okay, I didn't mean to stop your mojo. I
No,
just
no,
wanted to
that's
make sure
fine.
our audience was hanging.
So, within 2 years of the persecution beginning in 303, Diocletian announces he's retiring. And he retires to a place called Split, which is in now, I think it's Croatia, and builds a huge palace, which you can still see. Is now actually a tourist attraction.
Mm.
And Maximian has to retire in the West. And then Constantius Chlorus then becomes the Augustus of the West. And he immediately halts the persecution. It rages for another 6 years in the East under Galerius, but in the West it stops in the year 305.
Why was that? Was that because of his wife? Was that
Well,
Constantine's mother? Or
yeah, I think there's good evidence that he was partial already to Christianity.
okay,
It's interesting. He has among his children one whom he names Anastasia. And Anastasia is a word for resurrection
mm.
in Greek. And no pagan would ever name his child resurrection.
Yeah.
Immortality, which would be Athanasia. Athanasius actually is the male form of that.
Huh.
Well, that's pretty well most of the Greco-Roman pagan world believed in immortality, but it was an immortality of the soul. They were all worldly wise enough to believe that the human body, there's no way the human body once dead gets up and walks around. And so the concept of resurrection was a uniquely Christian concept. So it's intriguing to ask the question, why did he name his daughter Athanasia? Sorry, Anastasia. Um, the other evidence that we have about Constantius Chlorus also comes from his son, Constantine, who says that of all the emperors who ever came before him, only one of them was not demonized, namely his
Okay.
father. and he is scathing in his attack on the emperors who come before him. He says they're all in hell, except for his father. And so there's the witness of Constantine also, that his father was probably, if not in his own mind, a convinced Christian, at least definitely open to toleration,
Mm.
because there's no real reason why he would have stopped the persecution. The persecution had been framed in ideological terms as a war of extermination of Christianity, which it was described as responsible for all of the turmoil of the third century. And as I said, he stops it immediately.
And the west part that they're living in, is that somewhere near kind of what we would call the Low Countries in Europe today, or is it kind of
No,
Germany? Kind of where is it?
it includes them, but the
Okay,
West would also include the Roman province of Britannia, which is England, Wales. It would include Hispania, Spain, Gaul, France, the Low Countries, as you mentioned, Italy, and Latin-speaking North Africa, which would
okay.
essentially be Tunisia, Algeria, and everything west of that.
But home for Constantine would have
Um,
been
his home is basically wherever he is on his military campaigns.
okay. All
In
right.
the fourth century, because of the turmoil of the third century, the center of the Roman Empire is wherever the emperor's tent
Oh,
is.
okay. But is it kind of northwestern Europe, or have I gotten that kind of backwards of where
Yes,
of where Cloris
yes,
would have been? It wasn't
yes,
like in what we would think of as Gaul or France. It wasn't down in Spain. It wasn't over in some. I mean, it was kind of in that
yes. Ultimately,
northwestern
that's his origins. Yeah,
origin about we would be there.
yeah,
Okay. All right. So Constantine decides, right? So he becomes. How does
yeah. So
Constantine become
Constantius Chlorus dies within a year. He dies in the city of York. Eboracum is the Latin name for that town, in northern England, or
the?
the northern part of the province of Britannia. And Constantine is with him. And if you go to York, there is a wall in York that I've seen that was originally part of the Roman fortress.
Huh.
And in front of that wall, in the year 306, the legions in Britain, of which there would have been three, declare Constantine the Augustus of the West,
Ah.
which
So
is which is technically an illegal move, because there was another individual who should have stepped into the place, who was the Caesar, and Constantine was not the Caesar. Um, so then, over the next 6 years, Constantine is involved in significant warfare on what is now the European continent, seeking to make real his acclamation to be the Augustus. And the last great battle is fought with a man named Maxentius, in outside the walls of Rome. The Battle of the Milvian Bridge is what it's technically known as in 311. And Augustine, 312, sorry. Constantine wins that battle. Maxentius riding his horse with full armor down into the Tiber, drowning. And by that point, Constantine has accumulated a number of Christian advisors, bishops, on his staff.
hmm.
And he will tell this to his first biographer, Eusebius of Caesarea, that on the day before the battle, he saw a vision in which he saw a cross, or he saw a sign in the heavens, which is probably, most scholars believe, the Chi Rho symbol,
Hmm.
the first two letters in Greek of our Lord's name, Christos, which is looks like an X, and then in the middle of it a rho, which looks like a P. It's a very old symbol that was used by Christians throughout the early years of Christianity. And he heard these words, "By this sign conquer." And so his troops are, when they go into battle the following day, they have on their shields and standards that symbol. And in other words, they go into battle as a professing Christian army.
Hmm.
Now, most of them would not have been Christians, and most of them were being fairly superstitious pagans, because on the Roman standards there would have been emblems of the various gods. They would have been campaign items that would indicate their various campaigns and their history of the specific legion, but there also would have been emblems of their patron gods. And so they were all ripped off and a Christian symbol put on, which indicates to me that Constantine must have been an enormously charismatic figure
Hmm.
to be able, because this is enough for his immediate subordinates to kill him, because they're asking their soldiers to go into battle under the aegis of a religion that had been hitherto heavily persecuted, excuse me, blamed for the ills of the empire, and suddenly now it's in favor with the emperor. And it tells me that either Constantine was a complete fool, because that's a politically idiotic move, or he was convinced of the reality of it, and he must have been a charismatic leader. You have these men in the history of the West and probably other parts of the world that I'm not as familiar with, who are just remarkable leaders and can carry by the force of their personality, can um, foster and engage incredible loyalty on part of their soldiers. Um, it might be politically incorrect, but Robert E. Lee was such a man during the American Civil War, and I think Constantine was also such an individual.
Well, you're saying that this was a man that other men wanted to follow. I mean, that they,
Exactly.
if he had some moxie, some gravitas, something about him that said, we're ready to get behind this guy. And that probably is maybe also would connect back to these three legions in Britain that would say, you're our guy, right? I mean, it
Yeah.
wasn't like they were trying to, curry favor with his father, right? It wasn't a matter of that because his dad wasn't around, right? Or his
Yeah.
dad had already
Exactly.
died. So
Yeah.
there had to be
Exactly.
something about the guy, maybe like Alexander or others, right? That they just wanted to get in behind him and they could.
Yeah. Alexander the Great is another good example. Here you have the Macedonian army that basically follows him all the way to the frontier of India.
So
Over
he
a
had to
10-year
have,
period.
yeah, he had to have something going for him, right? I
Yeah.
mean, other than
Exactly.
just the title itself today. Hey, we're enjoying our conversation about Constantine and learning a whole great deal about him. But so this is kind of a battle within the two sections, right? I mean, within the two halves of the empire. The West, they're trying to battle back and forth to figure out who is going to be the Augustus. Is that
Correct.
that's
Correct.
what's and is the same thing happening on the eastern side
No.
as well?
No. By the year 311, the Augustus of the East, Galerius, has fallen desperately ill. He probably had cancer, and he stops the persecution and asks, of all things, the church to pray for his healing. And he subsequently dies and is replaced by a man named Licinus. And so when Constantine conquers Rome, takes Rome, it's probably the first time he's ever been to Rome.
Mm.
Um, he obviously makes an arrangement with Licinus that they would rule the empire together as both an Augustus in the east, Augustus in the west. That breaks down in circa 321, 322, when Licinus, who was a pagan, initiates a small persecution of the church, and it becomes a pretext for Constantine to move against him.
Okay.
And he is defeated in battle in Greece, takes his own life, and at that point, Constantine is now the sole Augustus of the empire.
So the edict in Milan that totally did away with the Diocletian edict, though, right? That was between
It did.
Constantine and who, though? Where was
That
it?
was, yeah, that was issued by Constantine in
Okay.
313, but it was also in the name of Licinus. So
Okay. Okay.
Licinus agreed that the persecution was over in both. So peace came to the church in 313, but Licinus broke the agreement briefly for about a year in 321, 322.
And that was about all that Constantine needed as an excuse, right? To be
Exactly.
able to go, hey, we got to knock this guy out for the good of the order and for the good of the
Yeah,
church. Let's go ye therefore.
exactly.
Oh, what do you know? I won and I'm now the sole emperor. What a day, right?
Yeah,
That Cairo
exactly.
was really something, right? So,
Yeah, exactly.
so
So,
the,
so the
yes.
the scholarship that says, well, he's very ambitious for power, therefore he could not have been a genuine Christian. Um, I'm not exactly convinced. Well, I'm not convinced of that argument at all.
Mm,
I think we know enough about the reality of human nature as we see it displayed in the life of the church to find men who have deep ambitions for power and yet are probably serious Christians.
mm.
I think there's a bit of a conflict there, but be that as it may.
How about that? So then he moves. When does he move the capital to Byzantium to Constantinople? When does that happen?
Yeah, that would be in the 320s.
Okay.
So when he becomes the emperor, and that couldn't take place until Licinus was out of the picture.
Hmm.
When he becomes the emperor, he begins to initiate a wide variety of legislative decisions, which absolutely revolutionized the empire. So that during the period of his being Augustus in the West and then sole Augustus, um, between 313 and his death in 337, he basically transforms the empire. So one of the things that I think, as I began studying Constantine obviously quite a while ago, and in my early years, I followed probably the typical evangelical historiographical perspective on Constantine, which is he used the church for his own
Hmm.
ends.
Hmm.
And then in the mid 80s, there was a professor at the University of Toronto named Timothy Barnes who came out with a study called Constantine and Eusebius.
Okay.
And for me, it was a landmark study. Timothy Barnes himself was personally an atheist. I remember hearing him lecture on the reliability of Eusebius of Caesarea as a historian. And if you came into the lecture after the first 5 minutes in which he introduced himself and said a little bit about himself, you would have sworn that Timothy Barnes was a Christian and he was completely in line with where Eusebius of Caesarea stood regarding Christianity. But in the first 5 minutes, he said, "Now you need to know I'm an atheist. I don't buy any of this stuff, but that's of no value. That's of no significance. Let's get going talking about Constantine Eusebius." It was an absolutely brilliant lecture. And Barnes is a bit of a contrarian when it comes to history. I guess he's still living. He moved from the University of Toronto about 10 years ago to the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. And in the book, what he does is he says, okay, the problem, one of the problems here is how to get into the mind of another human being who lived 1700 years ago and really
Sure.
figure out what's really going on in his head. Um, that's virtually impossible in so many ways. I mean, we have enough problems trying to figure out what's going on in the head of somebody sitting across from us. Years ago, if you'll permit me the aside, I served as an elder, and I was an elder at my local church for about 5 years, and stopped being an elder when I began teaching at Southern because of my duties there. And I remember we interviewed a young woman who had been raised in the church for membership because it was a Baptist church, and
Hmm.
we asked her to tell her conversion story, and she began by telling us that she was converted through watching the movie The Titanic with Leonardo DiCaprio. And I'm
Okay.
thinking, you got to be kidding me. And apparently, it was the scene near the end when all the bodies are lying on the water, and got her thinking about eternity and whatever. And I remember in hindsight thinking, it's enough. We're having enough problems trying to figure out is this real? She
Right.
speaks our language. She's part of our culture. She grew up in our church. Let alone trying to figure out is some guy who lived 1700 years ago with a very different language, a very different culture, a completely different world. Is it real? So what Barnes argues is, well, one of the ways in looking at this is let's look at number one, what he said, and number two, what he did. And the list of what he did is absolutely overwhelming. In terms of revolutionizing the empire. So, for instance, one of the first things he did was he began to rebuild all the churches, the house churches that had been destroyed. He gave a significant amount of money to the church in Rome to build what will eventually become, in the latter or early Middle Ages, the Vatican. He removes taxation from all full-time ministers and elders in the church. Nobody in the Roman Empire had ever been free from having to pay taxes, except for the emperor's immediate family. I mean, that doesn't make any sense,
Right.
for governments to do that. He made divorce and remarriage enormously difficult, whereas it had been fairly easy to divorce and remarriage, especially for a Roman male, but even for Roman women could initiate divorce proceedings, unlike, say, the Jews, where that would not be the case. He outlawed crucifixion as a punishment. He ended
Huh.
the gladiatorial games. He, in 321, he passed legislation that made the Lord's Day a day of rest for everybody in the empire, except for farmers in the spring and in the fall when they'd be sowing and harvesting. So he's got a vast array. He began to shut down a number of pagan temples. Some scholars say, why didn't he shut down them all? Well, he doesn't have the power base to do that. Christian bishops, professing Christian bishops, now become some of his immediate advisors. So there's a vast array of legislation that he passes that is utterly transformative of the Roman world and is never tracked back. It changes the world. It's a revolution. Then secondly is what he said. And here the main figure that we have for what he said is Eusebius of Caesarea. And that's the importance in Barnes's mind of proving that Eusebius of Caesarea is a reliable historian, and that when he quotes somebody, he quotes reliably. And so what he did was he went to the various inscriptions that we have that Constantine would have had inscribed in the empire. I mean, one of the ways, I mean, they don't have the internet, they don't have television, they don't have newspapers. So how does the emperor get his stuff known? Well, one of the ways was through statues. This is what the emperor looks like. And then secondly was through inscriptions that would be put up at various parts of the empire of key legislative decisions. And where it can be checked through comparing what Eusebius cites and these various inscriptions, Eusebius is normally very accurate. And Eusebius records, and let me give two examples. In the early 320s, Constantine issues a declaration. This is around the time when he goes to war with Licinius. Part of it being the justification for his war, but he talks about the previous emperors, which I've already mentioned. And he says all of them were mad and demonized, and they're all in hell, except for one. Now, think about this. Let's say you have a president of the United States who, yes, normally would be critical of maybe his immediate predecessor, especially if he's of a different political party. But think of what it would be like for a president of the United States to say, every president before me, including, the highlights of the American presidency, Lincoln and Washington, they're all nuts. And I'm the only president who's ever been able to achieve anything. I mean, it's deeply problematic. The other text that is intriguing is in the late 320s, by the time in which he has taken the entire empire. He sends an email. He sends a letter.
That's really cool. We won't
He
say
sends a
Eusebius said
letter.
that.
He sends a letter to the emperor of the Persian Empire, Shapur II, who was a Zoroastrian, and persecuting the Christians. And he tells them, my army is dedicated to the God who of whom you are persecuting some of my fellow believers.
Wow.
If you touch one more of them, you'll have me to answer to. And Shapur ignored it, and Constantine declared war. And that war, basically, a hot and cold war, continued for the next roughly 300 years. It so weakened the Eastern Roman Empire and the
Hmm.
the Persian Empire when Islam bursts out of the Saudi Peninsula in the 630s. It was able to take out well, definitely the Persian Empire completely and large parts of the Eastern Roman Empire. Um, but that's a remarkable statement. You know, you think of again a Western power talking to some of, say, our allies in the Middle East, like Saudi Arabia, and basically telling the Saudis, you touch another Christian,
Mm.
we'll have us to answer to. Um,
Wow.
so those two documents, as well as which Eusebius quotes in his biography of um, of Constantine, as well as the vast amount of legislation, in my mind, convince me that in his mind,
Mm.
Constantine viewed himself as a Christian that God had raised up to Christianize the empire. Now, the problem we have, I think, is we tend to look at Constantine from the effects and legacy of what this meant over the next 1,000, 1,500 years. And I'll be honest, I think the legacy, which is what we call Christendom in the Middle Ages,
Mm.
is problematic. But that's not the best way to do history. Often many events in history have all kinds of unintended consequences, and so I can't. In other words, I can't judge the authenticity of Constantine's faith on the basis of his legacy over the next 1,000 years. I have to look at the evidence, either in writing or in
Right.
action, that is there. And it was Timothy Barnes who really kind of opened my eyes to that approach. And I mean, I'm trained as a historian. It made a lot of sense to me. And so he may not have been a Christian, but I think at this where we are today, I think we have to basically agree that in his own mind he thought he was, and he thought he was helping the Christian faith advance.
And as an example of that, would that also be why he sponsored up and was a major factor in the Council of Nicaea for the first?
Yeah,
I mean, just
yep.
along those same lines. Hey, this is heresy, and or not, or let's get together and let's figure this thing out. Or was it, it wasn't just to be able to keep peace in the valley, right? I mean, part of it, I would assume that would be part of it, right? He didn't want this tension to go back and forth on that, but part of it is be able to say, yes, I'm trying to, we're trying to do what is the right thing, or trying to be able to make sure this, this is heretical that Arius is pulling off.
Yeah, I think that's a very yeah, that's another good example of illustrating the reality of Constantine's commitment to
Yeah,
Christianity in his own mind.
yeah, right. How about that? And now, didn't do I have this right that his mother was she a very committed Christian from
It
early
would appear that
on?
his mother was committed as a Christian, and so this might have also been an influence, Helena, on his father, Constantius Chlorus. Um, I mean, she spends a considerable amount of time, which a number of her um, contemporary Christians thought was ridiculous, puttering around Jerusalem, trying to find evidence of where Jesus was crucified.
Yeah.
She comes up with a piece of wood that she thinks is part of the true cross.
But
And
now,
she
isn't
takes,
she the one that kind of sponsored the building of several churches in and around and
yeah,
what we've got, like maybe
oh
the
yeah,
one at the Beatitude, I mean at the uh Not to be, I mean, wherever the Sermon on the Mount was supposed to be, or
Yeah,
something like
yeah,
that. Is that? I mean, she
she
had
is.
several spots, right?
Yeah, she does. She is a she again. She's here following her son, who is a patron in terms of both funding and encouraging the building of various churches and
Sure.
rebuilding churches. Yeah,
Yeah. And if your mama decides that's what she wants to do, you're probably not going to get in her way, right? So
yeah.
that's that's probably
Well,
probably a good.
in fact, that's one of the reasons why Athanasius ends up coming to grief because during his first exile, one of the reasons for his first exile is the charge that he had said a number of nasty things about the emperor's mother in public.
Really?
Yeah,
Yeah, that guy didn't know when to quit, right? I mean, you
yeah,
wanted him on your side, right? Because he was certainly with you in the ditch, but maybe his discernment button wasn't that
yeah.
engaged, right? That's fantastic. Well, what a great thing to learn more about him, and to me at least, it kind of reminds me of a sorts, kind of like Cyrus the Great, in the sense that the Lord can use who the Lord wants to use, right? And so they may not 100% line up with everything you think that they might be, but nonetheless, if they're used for this good purpose, then they're used for this good purpose. And whether he was as Christian as you may or may not want him to be, might just be a secondary conversation instead of worrying about the primary.
Yeah, I mean, there has always been a perspective within among evangelical historians that would have viewed Constantine with significant approbation. So Jonathan Edwards is the classic example here, and
Oh,
Edwards argues that with the conversion of Constantine to Christianity, Satan received one of the great blows to his kingdom. Um, not every evangelical in Edwards's day would have agreed to him, but Edwards I think rightly saw the conversion of Constantine, whatever you mean by that,
hmm
as a turning point, a massive turning point, and it lays the foundation then for really Western civilization because Christianity then becomes the glue that binds together these various disparate elements that will come into Western Europe, namely the Germanic tribes and the Greco-Roman inheritance. Those are the three kind of major constituent elements. But what binds them together is the Christian faith.
mm.
And during the Middle Ages, and you and I probably both have problems with a lot of things that were done in the Middle Ages and thought, but nonetheless, you have the foundations being laid for what we call the West, in which we have grown up, of which we have been enormous beneficiaries, and which is one of the great, I think, political challenges and academic challenges of our own day where there are significant figures in politics, in media, in entertainment who hate the West. I find it very disturbing in academia, which is my world, that you have people who seem to be their goal in teaching is to undermine everything that we have come to value in Western culture. And not that Western culture is, perfect, but it has been an enormous blessing to the world in numerous ways. And in a real sense, the embrace of Christianity by Constantine lays the foundations for the beginning of a long process of historical development that produces Western civilization, Western culture, which has some very, very important distinctive features. One of them being the whole emphasis on the individual, which
Mm.
lays at the foundation of the importance of individual rights rather than the community, where the rights of the individual are often overridden. Anyway, that's a much longer,
Episode
story.
two, right, right.
Yeah,
That
episode
gets
two.
it part of that to
Yeah.
do. Dr. Haykin, we thank you so much for spending time with us today and helping us learn more about the things that are important to Christian history, which is why we do this podcast of This Week in Christian History. We hope that folks would continue, if you're watching this, to follow us on social media and allow us to be able to stay in contact with you back at our website at the centerforchristianhistory.com. Dr. Haykin, we appreciate it. Thanks for doing this yet again
My
with us.
pleasure.
All right.
My pleasure. Thank you.